Say hello and welcome to Let's Talk. This is John Kane. I am your host, and I'm not completely alone, but I'm without Regan today. She's not feeling well. No COVID stuff. She's just suffering from something else, and she needed to take the break today. She will be back with us next week. In fact, she's lining up a guest for us next week. This week, I have a guest. I have my friend Bob Hennelly, Robert Hennelly, professionally known as. I got Bob Hennelly joining me this week. We go back a ways here at WBAI, and of course, Bob has been, he writes for Salon. He also writes for the Chief Leader. He has been on. He's reported for the Village Voice, Pacifica Radio, WNYC, CBS Money Watch, and others. And interestingly enough, we have been kind of on the same track a little bit here with, frankly, with some of our questions, and because Bob is an investigative journalist, he's actually been able to, delve in and get some of the answers to the questions that we've raised as well. So I want to welcome Bob Hennelly back to Let's Talk. Bob, are you there? Can we catch up here?
It's an honor to join you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining me. You and I spoke the other day, but we've been following. Actually, I've been following some of the stuff that you've been writing. Obviously, luckily, I'm on your
Back
list.
at you. Back at you, John.
And we've been raising some of the questions. While there are plenty of people out there, spinning their own views and their own opinions about things like whether whether this is a hoax and where it comes from, and are the numbers being inflated. You and I are among those people who are every bit as skeptical, but almost in the opposite way. I mean, you and I have questioned whether they are actually undercounting the numbers. And so that's led to a series of your articles. Obviously, I've talked about it on my show. So I want to, that's kind of where I want to begin. Let me start by going through some of the numbers. And I follow numbers on the Johns Hopkins site, the Worldometer site. And for those who aren't aware, the United States has crossed the 1 million mark. Actually did it a couple of days ago. Their death total is over 60,000, which was, as many may recall, the downgraded estimate that not only Trump but Fauci and Birx downgraded their estimate down from 100,000 to 200,000 down to 60,000. Well, now the death total is above 60,000. It's probably close to 63 as we stand here. Even as they've upgraded that to 65 or 66 and now 70. It doesn't seem like there's any real slowdown, at least over a course of several days. The United States is still adding 2,000 deaths a day. And I've got to say again, these numbers are primarily based on data that is gathered from confirmed by test. And I know that that there has been a movement among many countries, including the UK, by the way, to start really evaluating deaths that are contributed to, or if not totally caused by COVID-19 or its equivalent. And there's a CDC standard for that. I know that's caused a lot of hype about people trying to add numbers, saying, "Oh, see, they're bumping up the numbers." But I think it's important to mention that. Now, the UK has passed Germany and France for the total number of cases and the total number of deaths, and they have passed Spain for the total number of deaths. So the UK, which, if you recall, was totally bought into the herd immunity thing in the beginning, and then of course they changed their tactics, and then Boris Johnson was admitted to the hospital, went into the ICU, and so they're suffering. Probably among the higher rates of infection and deaths, at least certainly in Europe. I think it's worth noting. And again, right now, only the United States, Spain, and Italy have more cases than the UK, and only United States and Italy have accrued more deaths as a result of it. The other country that's worth noting is Russia. Russia crossed the 100,000 case mark just yesterday, and they have been steadily rising. They are a country that has they're still peaking. They haven't reached the peak in terms of number of cases per day. Although I will say their death totals seem a little suspect. I mean, they're saying that only about 1%. I mean, they're at 100,000. They're only saying that they have about 1,000 deaths, which seems unbelievably low. Or maybe unbelievable is not the right word. Not believable is probably more like it. So I throw those things out there. But I want to say it. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and we've got a lot to talk about, and we've got lots of time to do it. So, all the people who keep trying to compare this to the flu and the numbers, associated with the number of flu cases and the number of flu deaths. I asked you the question the other day, and we never really got to it in our conversation. When they come up with these numbers for death by flu or number of cases, they're not doing a pathological test to determine whether somebody actually has the flu virus in all of those cases year by year. They're making assumptions by symptoms and all of the other observational criterion to determine that somebody either has the flu or that the flu contributed to death. And I think that's an important distinction, because everybody's holding this really, really high standard to whether you determine somebody has COVID-19, but that's not the standards that's been used in the past. I mean, is that right?
No, I think that that is something we would call analytical sampling.
Right.
Where they have a certain sense of what's happening. They have a kind of surveillance in Americans' hospitals. It's very important to just unwrap this in some basic ways. Our entire understanding of this crisis is framed by the way that the government has come to understand it. And that should tell you all you need to know about how ignorant we really are of our circumstances. This is the same government that ignored it, that missed it, and then proceeded to give guidance through the Centers for Disease Control about doing things that health professionals that I covered for the chief leader screamed to high heaven back in March 11 would spread the disease. And this is so important. And speaking to folks who are Native American and people that understand Native American history, this will resonate in a very creepy way. Because the CDC has helped spread this disease. And I can just document it for you. It's all been reported, but it's not put forward in a way in the conventional media that really helps people understand the risk that we face.
Well, explain
Early
that, though. When you say the CDC has helped spread the disease, I want to say that I want you to explain that in a way that doesn't sound like it's that it's an intentional.
I will just give you very chapter and verse. This is all verifiable. I'm at Stuck Nation. It's my Twitter handle, adopted long before we were really stuck.
Yeah.
At home or wherever we are. But the reality is that as early as March 11th, the New York Nurses Association, which is the leading union in New York State representing nurses, protested the decision by the CDC to issue a guidance which basically undid basic public health. And what they did was they declared that an N95 respirator mask, which is the one to be used in the clinical setting when a healthcare professional is going to encounter someone that's indeed infectious, that, under normal circumstances, was to be worn for each encounter with an infected patient. That would be one. If it lasted 5 minutes, if it lasted a minute, if it lasted whatever period of time it lasted, it is then to be taken off the healthcare provider and discarded. The CDC, keeping an eye towards inventory, and to keep pressure off the White House from being revealed to not having properly prepared this country for a pandemic that was predicted for at least people deeper in this field than I am, we're talking about it for 30 years, decided to issue an advisory that would help manage the inventory of existing masks. Right. And the nurses predicted, and we reported in the chief leader, that such an abrogation and contradiction of basic medical procedure would, one, cause the healthcare professionals to become contaminated. Number two, cause them to die in an inordinate number. And then three, Here's the coup de grace to spread the disease among the public as people sought to get treatment. And that's exactly what happened. And that's not the only case of sliding guidance.
Right.
Count number 2 in the indictment would be the decision by the CDC to advise people, and this came up organically because in New York City, early on, the subway workers who work in a very difficult environment and read the newspaper, and many of them have advanced degrees and are, they may work a blue-collar job, but they're very smart people, were aware of what was going on and started to don masks in the subway. They were being written up by middle managers who said that their mask didn't comport with the uniform.
Jesus.
And management was citing the CDC, who said masks should not be worn by people that are healthy in public because they were concerned about, here's another theme, wait for it, the inventory. Count number 2. Eventually, we all ended up wearing masks, and to the credit of the MTA, they finally followed, and here's a constant theme, the example of the workers. That would be the people who are the lowest level in society's order, leading the leaders. There's a lot of that going on right now. And so now everyone's wearing masks. Count number 3 in this indictment, which really does need to be brought by someone, maybe the UN, who knows, certainly Congress won't, was a decision initially, tell people that if you're a first responder, EMT, and you encounter a person who is infected, the FDNY advised you to leave your position, go home, and quarantine for 2 weeks. Why? Because they understood that even if you weren't displaying symptoms, running a fever, coughing, or sneezing, that you were asymptomatic, and that for an undetermined number of days prior to becoming symptomatic, you could spread this lovely virulent disease throughout the population. Scroll forward just a couple of weeks later, based on the fact that so many people were sick, everybody changed the guidance, thank you very much, federal government, so that only if you were symptomatic were you to stay home. So in 3 stages that are all equally verifiable, even in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the CDC, in the attempt to manage the crisis, made the crisis worse.
Well, and I want to
Is that clear, do you think?
Yeah, but I also think, some of the mask issues, like wearing the mask in public, I think there was a conscious decision to try to control the optics of it. I honestly think and that's why you see somebody like Pence or Trump who refuses to wear a mask because they think it somehow diminishes their masculinity or something like that. And I think the whole idea of trying to keep people from the mass population from wearing masks, it would somehow stem the fear, I guess, or the psychological impact of the U.S. being.
Professor, you get very deep into the deeper psychosocial reality, which is this whole question that wearing a mask in this current climate betrays a sense of equality, a sense of mutuality, and a sense of collectivity, something that would be anathema to the narcissists like President Trump and Vice President Pence.
I got to mention something else as it relates to masks because there Native people can actually have over the last few years have actually been able to be cited and charged for wearing masks because
that's right.
Because of the whole protest thing. So there are actually some people on probation today from things like Standing Rock and other places who are actually forbidden to wear a mask as a condition of their probation. How crazy is that?
Oh, perfect.
All right, now I want to shift gears a little bit. One of the things that is becoming a trend has to do with math, and I want to discuss what numerators and denominators mean. And so first, let me explain. For one thing, the way testing is being done, testing for the disease, it is not a broad-based type of testing that that spans symptomatic versus asymptomatic, zip codes, age, gender, ethnicity, all that stuff. It is the people who are banging on the door to get into a hospital that get tested. And in fact, if you are symptomatic, you have to be symptomatic enough and meet other criteria to finally get a test. So the tests are not something that you can extrapolate over the broader population and come up with really reasonable numbers.
John, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I know you're on a roll, but can I interrupt you with some updated reporting?
Go ahead.
I would say, and this goes back to your number, part of the problem about this, and this goes back to a story we broke in the Chief Leader back in early April, like April 6th, related to where deaths are happening, and that's an important. I promise I'll connect back to testing. But very early on, New York City SDNYMTs were saying they were seeing a science fiction-like uptick in fatal cardiac arrest at home. And when I say an uptick dramatically, it's like 20 to 30 that expect this time of year annually, annualized for this same time, say in 1919, around spring. Instead, they were seeing 260, 270, close to 350 fatal cardiac arrests in people's homes. This became this was really, and still isn't really being counted in the overall thing, and this is happening around the world, this secondary impact of residential homes. Now, to that end, at the time, EMTs said, listen, if you're going to beat this thing, because all the politicians are focused on the hospitals, but as we know, the public health threat, the disease is in the community. It's our communities that are ailing. So there have been.
They call it community spread. Now. That's what they call it, right?
That's right. And so there have been issues in New York City and California and in New York State to begin to go out proactively to start measuring in this kind of analytical sampling I talked about the population with a particular focus on communities of color where we've seen by initial results this disease is particularly hitting communities of color hardest. Why? Well, because it's a place where the access to health care has been historically denied, and the existence of chronically ill people without proper treatment is rampant. And
Bob, let me stop you there because trust me, I was kind of circling back around to this as well. So let me finish doing what I'm doing with the numbers here because it does get back to exactly what you're talking about. And so my point is that most of the numbers, especially the U.S. numbers, that we can speak to, frankly, all the numbers have been primarily confirmed by test and it's never been the broad population that was available to those tests. So you get the sense of numbers. Now,
the death, that's true.
And this is both for the confirmed cases and for the deaths. Now, they started, adding some of the more obvious deaths by COVID to those numbers. But so those numbers, that's where the numbers have been coming from. All the Worldometer, the Johns Hopkins numbers, they all come from that. So. But when they started doing these antibody testing, they decided, okay, we know that there's a spread beyond what's being tested. They acknowledge that, although they could never quantify it. So when they started doing antibody testing, they took that approach towards trying to do broad-based testing so they could extrapolate those numbers. And the Stanford testing that they did. And the models that they created, they came up to a determination that they're certainly in California, there may be 35 times more people infected than those that have been tested and confirmed by tests. That's what they determined.
Right.
So, and I don't disagree with that. Here's where it gets a little sketchy. So then people started doing math as well. If there's really 35 times more people by test, if we stick that in to the denominator in calculating the mortality rate, we're going to bring that mortality rate down. So let me explain for those who need a refresher on math. When you want to determine the percentage of mortality, you take the total number of deaths and you divide it by the total number of cases, and then you end up with a percentage. In the United States, that percentage is still coming in based on the confirmed by test only, still coming in around 5%, about 5% of those tested. Those who get sick, who have the disease, about 5% of them die. It's higher in some countries, dramatically higher in some countries. But so when they said, well, but we're going to change the denominator because we're going to increase that by 35 times, they said, oh, look, see now the death rate dropped. But here's the problem. They didn't adjust the numerator, which gets back to what you started to allude to. Right. Because if you're going to say we're going to expand the numbers in cases based on the obvious that there are more cases than we're actually testing for, then you've also got to look at the deaths that have been only confined to those by tests. And when you look at the numbers that you're talking about, where you're seeing an increase in the number of deaths overlaid over last year this time or previous years this time,
right,
you realize that the total number of deaths, even if you haven't been able to confirm them by test associated with COVID-19, that there's a significant number. So you can't just change the denominator without changing the numerator. And I'm not saying that the mortality rate isn't going to come down. It clearly will come down. But when I hear people extrapolating these numbers associated with antibody testing and trying to change the equation for calculating mortality without addressing the fact that the dead have been grossly undercounted. Right. I think that is, this is where the problem we get into, and I've talked about this before. Science and certain research and analyses should be based on what the numbers tell you, not trying to satisfy what you hope the numbers will tell you.
Right. Well, I wanted to, the one point that I would add, that's exactly right. And one of the pieces of this that is not broadly understood is that the way to really only get a handle on this is to speak to the undertaker, the keeper of the crematorium, and your EMT.
Right.
Because these are the people that have injured. In fact, I broke a story in Salon. First it was Insider NJ. The New Jersey Funeral Directors Association, not known to be like Karen Silkwood, like whistleblowers, confirmed for me. This guy represents all of the funeral directors that are part of his association, the leading trade group of New Jersey. It's had just a huge loss of life. He confirmed for me, and I might say at some risk to himself, that the state was now requiring that COVID deaths no longer be reported as the primary cause on the death certificate. And he explained to me that was because of pressure and guidance, there's that word again, from the federal government and Vital Statistics. It's under the control of the CDC. So COVID-19 will be a secondary cause of death. And he said, quite frankly, I'm saying this and breaking this silence because my concern is people will be lulled into a false sense of security about how well we're managing this. And the TV numbers that we are looking at, that we are basically, and I'm saying this, really determining the flow of this entire episode, are grossly inaccurate. And yet we are still, MSNBC, everyone's repeating the numbers and the guidance as a way to use this to open business back up. And he said to me that in New Jersey, this time of year, per month, they would expect 6,000 bodies that had to be processed. Half of those, because of the nature of this market, would be cremated. Half would be interred, maybe not in New Jersey, but somewhere. They were seeing 4,000 additional bodies per month. In New York City, I consulted with the undertakers. They were reporting in-home deaths 4 to 6 times the normal level. So it really doesn't matter. Okay, and we parsed this through in our show prep when we spoke at length the other day. It really doesn't matter whether the person is tested for COVID or not, because the whole point of all this, the guided meditation by Governor Cuomo, was they didn't want to see the hospital system crash. Remember, that's the way this whole flattening the curve thing was presented. We saw what happened in Italy, and the lesson, the takeaway was we're going to protect the hospitals.
Well, and to that point, the whole idea was that if you could keep the hospitals from being overrun, you made look. There's a certain population that was going to die once they contracted the disease, but they didn't want the number of deaths to be exacerbated by the hospitals not being able to treat. So the whole idea of flattening the curve and staying beneath the hospital's capability was to stop not just what would be, I hate to say this, but the normal course of deaths due to this disease, but the deaths that would be increased because of overrunning the hospital. So you're right.
Right.
I mean, for 6 weeks, for 6 weeks they warned and they put out all these worst case scenarios about what would happen or what was going to happen, not what would happen, but what was going to happen.
Well, one of the things about this is, and your point, that's exactly right. And part of the problem that came out of this, though, was that the people took away these messages. I mean, there's few things operating here. And again, I'm guided just by conversations, by having the honor and privilege of just basically interviewing 24/7 EMTs reporting back with what they're seeing, right? This is the other problem. Like, the corporate media likes to lionize first responders, but we don't encounter them for their advice. And the thing that they were noting was that when they went to these homes where people were dying, what they were encountering was a mix of things. We talked about this. One, like you say, they were forewarned about the hospital being a place where, like, we used to think hospitals in the 19th century is a place to die. So people were like, no, thank you. People with chronic conditions or who are men like ourselves, that is, our wives will tell you, like to avoid the doctor in general.
Yeah.
Find any good reason not to go to the hospital. There's that. And then also people, and this is the scary part, people that were discharged, maybe one, maybe two times from the hospital, being reported by our governors as a happy success story because they were discharged only to go home and die in the front parlor. Mm-hmm. Now, where is that piece of data? And to the point about all the other people that die of other related issues or chronic acute healthcare issues that are on the 10 because of the crisis, it's all part of the fact that we have an undergate, and always have had, as a matter of public policy and corporate greed, an undersized public health system. And you would know this, and Native people know this better than anyone else.
Well, and obviously, if you look at the numbers coming from the most blatant are the numbers coming out of Navajo territory, which are alarming. Only New Jersey and New York have a higher rate of infection than the Navajo nation does, and it's no, everybody kind of struggles for these explanations, but they avoid, it's like you and I talked. They avoid the obvious conclusion that racism plays a role in this thing. But I want to back up on the one thing when you talk about people not going to the hospital, and again, when you've had a 6-week drumbeat of how bad hospitals were and how bad they were going to be, that obviously detracts from anybody who might have normally gone to the hospital.
Oh, you think the 18-wheelers? Do you think the refrigerator units with the 18-wheelers with the corpses falling out? You think that was
yeah? That's how people
wasn't a good marketing choice.
That's how people are discharged, right? But I mean, the best
right.
example of this is when you convert the Jacob Javits Center into a hospital, and then you bring the USS Comfort up into the to dock out at New York. And the whole idea with those two facilities was that they were going to treat the people who were non-COVID, the people who would show up would be serving the public the way the hospitals did before COVID-19, and nobody came. I mean, nobody.
That's right.
Nobody came to Jacob Javits. So where were all the broken arms? Where were all of the other ailments that were non-COVID related? Because those things still continued. I will say, on one hand, the death rate normally should have reduced by some factor because of less auto deaths, automobile
right.
deaths, and less workplace deaths. But obviously the numbers aren't suggesting that. But the fact that they created two facilities that would handle the non-COVID emergencies, and nobody showed up, that just is an indication on how very few people would seek medical help during this time, COVID or non-COVID. I mean, so when you throw those numbers in there about the people dying at home, even if they didn't have COVID-19 kept them from going to the hospital.
Well, and that's right. And then also, one of the things about this is the way that there's a movement in the 1880s, 1890s. There was something called the Henry Street Settlement that got its start in Lower Manhattan. And it was this breakthrough thing driven primarily by female nurses who had this insight that if they wanted to improve the health conditions in the Lower East Side, which was filled with immigrants and undocumented folks, that the key way to doing that was to engage people where they lived, where they shopped, where they worked. It was the beginning of the concept of even a school nurse, right? That wasn't always a given. Mm-hmm. And so this country had an understanding that if you wanted to keep your people well, you deployed your medical resources and your public health, and most importantly, health education, into the schools. That architecture has been systematically dismantled in our adult lifetime, and in its place has been put a death machine for which we borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars to keep the world on hair trigger related to us fighting our further notice war on terrorism. That's the truth. That's the truth you'll hear on this station, but we're not even clearing our throat on that in Congress.
Right.
So everything we've done, the entire alignment of our national security state, made us more vulnerable to the disease that is taking so many of our loved ones.
Right. Hey, Bob, let me. We're at the bottom of the hour. I'm going to take a bit of a break. Have Reggie play a tune so catch our breath here a little bit.
Excellent.
But stay with me. I want to continue on this thing, but we're just going to take a break just for a moment or two.
Cool. Great.
All right. Go ahead, Reg.
Thanks.
All right. That's a little bit of Murray Porter and Don't Let Go. And don't. I mean, hang on through this. I mean, I will say, when I hear people say we're going to get through this and we're going to be fine. Look, there are many of us that are going to get through this, but many of us aren't. And I don't want to try to put spin happy tales associated with this thing. Are there some things that we see that are encouraging? Yeah, there's some things, but make no mistake about it. This is a disaster, and it's a disaster at a bunch of different levels. And because it's a disaster at so many levels, there are decisions being made to prioritize the disasters, and I'm afraid lives aren't necessarily put at the highest end of that. But before I get back into it, look, I want to remind people, this is WBAI, and we are listener-supported radio. We're entering into our fund drive. We've been doing a little bit of fundraising here over the last couple of weeks. We did a shortened show last week, so we could do a little bit of a fundraising show. Going forward, I'll probably be reduced to an hour and probably skipped a few weeks here on WBAI, although I'll probably still put something out. We'll see how that goes. But the best thing that you can do is, if you can support WBAI, even in these tough times, is to not forget that we're delivering something to you. And hopefully we're delivering something to you that you value and that you can place enough of a value on that you'll go to the phone lines. You'll go to 516-620-3602 and make a contribution. Become a BAI buddy. Do it in the name of the show. One of the best ways to keep not only WBAI on the air, but to keep me on the air is to support the show, support the program. And the money that comes in does not go to me, but it does send a message to management that this is one of the shows that you want to listen to. And look, there's been a lot of things that WBI has gone through and has encountered over the last 6 months, and some of us have been there every step along the way. Even the short takeover that took place, I kept cranking out shows, and I tried to make sure that I was there for you. And so I ask you to be there for us and be there for WBAI. So as we go into this fund drive, do what you can, to support the station. Go to WBAI.org or to give to WBAI. That's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org, and make a donation. Become make a one-time donation. Do what you can. And look, and I know some of you are doing okay. And I'm not just talking about because of stimulus checks either. Some of you guys are still doing okay. I know there's lawyers and there's people who are professionals who listen to this station and to this show who do have the means to keep a station like WBAI on the air. And make no mistake about it, the economic impact of this disease is taking its toll, and there are companies that will not be around when all is said and done. And we hope that WBAI is not one of those casualties of this pandemic. And because we have underlying conditions, we're in a constant state of struggling financially because it's tough to be a radio station in New York City. So I ask you to dig deep, do what you can, and as often as you can, make a contribution, become a monthly contributor through the Buddy program, or to give a one-time donation. And again, the number is 516-620-3602. We are a 2-hour show today, so after we finish hour one, I will go to your phone calls, and I look forward to hearing from you and hearing your experiences, response to some of what Bob and I are talking about, but any of the experiences and any of your observations. We may not always agree. One of the things I'll say about this show, I'm offering a Native perspective, but I'm also not offering the Native perspective, but a Native perspective. I'm looking at this data. I'm looking at what's happening, not just, I'm where I live here on the Seneca Territory, it's geographically known as Western New York. So we're covering a large area. And of course, I'm connected to Native peoples throughout Turtle Island, both on either side of the imaginary line, U.S. and Canada side. So I do have a sense for what's happening in Native territories, and some of it's very specific, and some of it's not so specific. We have had we've had at least one death here on the territories that where I reside. So we know what's happening economically. The Seneca Nation, its main source of public finance is gaming, which has been shut down for over a month. And there have been people who have lost their jobs, and so that main source of public finance has been eliminated from Seneca Nation coffers. So it has impact. So, I just want to say that I bring something different, but I also bring you to the air. I bring you to the air as a talkback show. So if if whether you agree with the perspective that I offer, it's important for me that you know that it exists, and whether you agree with the opinions that I offer, it's about having the dialogue. So I thank those of you who listen. I thank those of you who contribute, and I ask more of you to contribute. And if you can contribute a little bit more, then by all means, please do. So I had to make that appeal. I know that as we enter into the month of May, I may not be on the air as much as I normally am. So, and as it turns out, I didn't realize, but I'm one of the last 2-hour talkback. I think I am the last 2-hour talkback show on WBAI. And and I, frankly, once I got that second hour back, it was you, the listeners, that that fill that time, and it's one of the best parts of the show. So we'll do that once we get past the top of the hour. So I want to reintroduce Bob Hennelly, who is a investigative journalist. He writes for Salon and the Chief Leader, and has been a voice heard on other Pacifica stations, including WBAI. He's been heard on WNYC and CBS Money Watch. And Bob, you and I, like I said, have been kind of following the same threads on a lot of this stuff. But you, as an investigative journalist with ties to the unions and to the people who are on the street, who are doing these jobs, I referred to you not only as somebody who is in touch with the first responders in terms of EMTs, but the last responders in terms of the morticians and the
right.
So. Yeah, I want to continue a little bit on what we were talking about, because I think there is a real effort to massage the numbers, and I don't mean the raw data, but I think emphasize different data points to drive a narrative that's going to, frankly, get people back to work and get people,
Well, that's so true, and we've seen this. This is playing out in the Midwestern area, where we are seeing the meatpacking industry. About 80% of beef is organized under the United Food and Commercial Workers, but poultry about 40%. But we're seeing in throughout the area where these meat plants, where people are packed in to do this work, have been hotbeds for spreading the coronavirus. We have seen this president who was reluctant to use the War Productions Act, which was the provision enacted by Congress and during the Truman administration to help the United States government in time of war be able to get access to resources and production that it needed, while he was reluctant to do that for N95 masks. And this is how sick and sinister this guy is, okay? While he was reluctant to do that and created this pernicious environment where he had the states and hospitals and local governments and county governments competing with each other on the global market for access to this essential personal protective equipment, he has now invoked this power that he has, which is considerable, to compel the meat processing plants to remain open
Of all things, right?
without requiring.
Yeah.
Right. Requiring that they do the basic things that are necessary to keep the workers safe and to keep the public safe. So you have the situation where
let's break that down a little bit. You've got people standing not only shoulder to shoulder, but because these are factories essentially. You've got people who are standing across from each other, shoulder to shoulder as well. Oftentimes, what they call disassembling, but basically cutting up these meats, for processing. Rendering, yeah. So you have people doing all this stuff, all these euphemisms, right? Doing this work, literally breathing on each other, and again, you forget the other issues associated with breathing on the food, because apparently this doesn't survive being cooked. But the idea that they're going through this stuff and they can't take the breaks, they can't even take the moment to grab a tissue, and they're not working with masks. None of that stuff. I mean, it's absurd. But here's the other thing, and I got to bring this up, because even as people want to promote capitalism and the free market, and the idea that, well, we're going to ask companies to do certain things for us, and they should do the right thing. You have to understand that it has been very well established that because companies cannot put a higher priority on the right thing. They've got to put a higher priority on making money, because they have to, their responsibility is to their shareholders. And it's been proven out time and time again where there's actually been lawsuits brought against companies who didn't do what was always in the best interest of the people they're responsible to. So you can't expect a company.
That's important.
Yeah. So you can't expect a company to say, we're going to halt production of the stuff that makes money. And we're gonna increase the production.
And
on
I wanted to raise this before I forgot about it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Forgive me for interrupting, but one of the most pernicious parts of this proposal that Trump has in the order that was executed is that it also provides legal protections from these same companies for any potential occupational health liability from the workers that they're employing and profiting off of.
Yeah.
So this is and that's, and I guess the thing about this, when you talk about the connection between capitalism and this current moment, the reality is that, and I did this piece for Salon a while back called Revolution by Pandemic, and it's on Salon. One of the things that this whole system has done is created a reality where, because of greed being the driving thing that organizes our society entirely, we have developed this efficient system, real-time delivery. And every business major learns this, the idea being that you never have anything more than is absolutely necessary at any given moment, because the drive is to have as much money in the Cayman Islands and away from the tax man as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so it means that you don't give even workers an advanced schedule. We know so many of our brothers and sisters in the quote-unquote gig economy wait by the phone in the morning for a phone call about when they're to report for work, like a shape-up, like on the waterfront. I know I date myself. And similarly, we see the same thing with masks. Heaven forbid that we have a supply of something like surgical masks on hand, so that in the event of a crisis, we have something to work with. So this whole system is predicated on money and concentration of capital as being the highest and most valued human endeavor.
Well, and let's not forget, that's how they're measuring economy. I mean, they're measuring it by the stock market. They're measuring it by numbers that don't ever address. I mean, you've made a solid point coming out of the 2008 crash, that there hasn't been a recovery for the vast majority of people, not just people of color, but certainly people of color. But there hasn't been a recovery. So all of the numbers that are inflated, the employment numbers, there has never been a time where there has been a higher level of poverty as a percentage of the population than today, or then not just today, than 2 months ago. So this wonderful booming
pre-COVID.
economy, pre-COVID, this booming economy that Trump wants to brag about, and worse yet, the economy that people are longing to return to. What people want to go back
Right.
to, the old normal sucked. And I think it's got to be made clear that no, that's not acceptable. So look, if we have a pandemic revolution, if it's a complete revolution that brings us right back to where we started, then that's not a good thing.
No, and I think to your point that one of the things about this is the moment, and it's under tremendous pressure right now because I think the powers that be know the potential for things to go south for them. Essential workers are enjoying a kind of, I think there was Rick Wolf, Professor Wolf, so insightful as an economist, observed that at some point coming out of the Great Plagues in Europe, there was a period of time where labor was scarce because so many people had died. And in that window, skilled people were able to raise their wages. Well, it's not exactly analogous, but right now, the people that do the physical work, who don't have the luxury of working from home, who have to go out into the world to make a living, are actually a higher percentage of in organized labor because your transit sector, to some degree your healthcare sector, and first responders, these are people that are in unions. And so what I'm seeing across the country, I mean, I will tell you, John, and I feel that this is not said enough. It's hardly said at all. The only thing standing right now between this pandemic overrunning and destroying the United States and the evil empire of Donald Trump is the American labor movement.
Right.
And I give you example after example where it was nurses putting their jobs on the line while they're putting their lives on the line who stood up and spoke about the CDC sliding guidance. It was early on the TWU, Transportation Workers United, under the international leadership of John Samuelson, who, I don't know if you heard this caper, but a JetBlue flight, a selfish son of a gun, flew out of New York, having a coronavirus test pending, lands at Miami Beach or West Palm Beach, and then informs the flight crew, the union flight crew, that he's tested positive. I guess he wanted to get the luggage carousel first.
Jesus.
And in the process, he had to be removed by EMTs, and the flight crew were ordered back into revenue service by their manager. And they protested and said, no, we're not going to. And, of course, the middle manager, not knowing as much as the working people, see a theme here, said, oh, no, we're not going to go in because we're not going to take it back into revenue service on behalf of the public because we could be carrying the disease because even if you're asymptomatic with coronavirus, you can still contaminate other people. Right. So once again, workers smarter than management. In that case, the union backed them up. The governor of New York and Schumer from New York called JetBlue. Those workers were given 2 paid weeks. But there's example after example of what's happening where workers are standing up. And this is why what's coming up next, to be quite honest with you, we really need to stand up and back up these workers. Whatever your feeling is about eating meat, nobody should be working as long as those workers are being put at risk in the meat plants. We need to stand with those workers.
Right.
And we need to make sure that nothing gets back to normal. And that's true for all these workers. If we're going to say you're essential, there's got to be a social contract, a new Magna Carta that says you get protective equipment and you get testing and you get informed real-time information about the risks you face. And if you don't get that, you don't show up for work.
Well, and here's the problem, Bob, and I know you've talked about this. The number of people who are unionized at this point, I mean, the workforce numbers have been, dropping significantly. I mean,
it's down to 10%. If you had a municipal, it's a little higher.
I mean, and when you think about a situation where when you can attribute things like the 40-hour work week and time and a half for overtime and so many of the vacations, so many of the things that people associate, health care, health insurance, some of these things,
right.
That when you associate all that stuff with unions, and then you realize today that you can't support a family on a 40-hour. You can't have a single one income 40-hour
right.
a week income that's going to support a family. So instead of the bar actually, the quality of life improving since that tremendous work and accomplishment that unions accomplished, coming out of the 50s and the 60s and such. I
Right.
mean, we're actually back in a place now where you got two earners working 60 hours a week to maintain a quality of life that our parents were able to give us back, when we were kids. I mean, it's been
Absolutely.
such a backward step. It's unbelievable.
Well, now what they're doing is using the scarcity that's upon the land as a result of the mismanagement of the Trump administration. They're going to use this scarcity to force people back into dangerous work conditions and to be intimidated by the very real deprivation. And that's why you see, for instance, for these characters, the Civil War was never over. Let's be honest about it. They fly that flag because they're still fighting.
Well, and the problem is neither party is really working. The Democrats aren't working hard for unions either. I mean, I think it's really important that people realize.
Well, I will say the only thing is I think that at least, what did someone tell me? They're at the table, and one old labor leader said to me, "It's better to be at the table than on the menu."
Yeah. I'll
that was a joke, John.
Yeah,
that was a joke. I should say it news. All right.
So, but anyway, look, hey Bob, I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll get you back here. You and I will stay in touch. Is there any?
We will.
What should people look for to follow some of your work? Obviously, you're doing pieces for Salon.
Okay,
and Chief
sure.
Leader. Give me your info.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Also, at Stuck Nation, which is the way that it's my Twitter handle. I adopted that when I was still at WNYC. Back during Occupy Wall Street, and I was covering those young people that were putting stuff at risk and trying to speak truth to power. And I was kind of like, this is really a Stuck Nation. And then I didn't realize it would be so appropriate. And then also the chiefleader.com. It is really while it has covered the civil service in New York City, we do cover labor across the country. We were, we didn't get into this time, but talk about false narratives. We covered and still covered the 9/11 scandal, where so many workers, thousands and thousands of workers, went and tried to turn around Lower Manhattan after the 9/11 attacks. And based on Christy Todd Whitman, the former EPA administrator's guidance, there's that word again, that the air was safe to breathe, ended up breathing some of the most toxic air that's ever been on the planet. In the process, we've lost more people from the occupational exposure from 9/11. And 50 to 60,000 people with different cancers. In fact, we're trying to find, and we should follow up at some point because it's an important story. There are some 19,000 K through 12 former public school kids that Rudolph Giuliani, when he was mayor, ordered back into 29 schools in the hot zone, and 2,500 teachers. And many of these individuals are sick, and there's an effort to try to reach out to these young people that are all over God's creation to let them know, particularly because of the pandemic, that they may suffer from a pre-existing condition they're not even aware of. So again, thanks for being so generous with this platform. I always enjoy speaking with you, and let's do it again soon.
All right, you and I go back though. You and I
we do.
downstairs up at.
That's right. Since the last time I was fired by Pacifica, I get fired every 10 years. All right, brother. Stay strong.
You take care. All right, and that's Bob Hennelly, writer for Salon and the chief leader, and again on many other outlets. He does some great work, and I've really enjoyed having the chance to spend this much time. It's rare. It's a rare thing to have somebody who isn't brought on television or on radio who is on for more than just 5 minutes and gets to spit out a few sound bites. So the idea that Bob Hennelly and I could have a 1 hour conversation that you all can be a part of is what WBAI offers. So again, I encourage people to go to the pledge line, go to 516-620-3602. Look, make a donation. Do it in the name of Let's Talk with John Kane and Regan DeLoggins. Just Let's Talk. Will show up in the text boxes. Become a WBAI buddy and do it in the name of Let's Talk. And support WBAI. It's the way we can continue to deliver what we're delivering to you. All right, hey, we're at the top of the hour. Apparently, we didn't have a news segment this hour, so we'll take a break. Reg, you'll cue up some tunes, probably another tune from from our favorite Murray Porter, and then we'll go to your calls. Just to give you the number out front, it is 212-209-2877. That's 212-209-2877. You can mark that down, and we'll be taking your calls when we come back from break. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk. We do not have Regan DeLoggins with us this week. She was not feeling well, non-COVID symptoms, so I'm not worried about that. I'm sure she's going to be fine. We do expect her to be back next week. If we are actually back next week, I haven't gotten next week's schedule yet. But, we're going to do something one way or the other. So, look, I do want to remind people that we are entering fund drive, but we're always in fund drive mode. So, go to the pledge line 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a donation. You can go online. You can go to www.give2wbai.org. You can make a one-time donation, and you can make those as often as you want. You can become a buddy and make a monthly contribution through your checking account or your credit card. You can do something, do $10 a month. And that, for us, that adds up because that ends up being revenue that we can count on. And do it in the name of Let's Talk, and that'll keep me hanging around as well. All right, let's. I'm going to go right to the phone lines. I know we've got a few people lined up. We're going to try to get a bunch through. This may be the last time for a while that we end up having a full hour, have the luxury of having a full hour of talk back. So we're going to try to maximize that and get the most out of it we can. So caller, you're up first. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hey, how you doing? This is Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
You know where I'm from.
Yeah, how you doing?
Okay. Listen, my deep condolences to anybody out there who lost anybody, and my prayers are with them. The thing I wanted to point out is I really like what you said before about having different ideas and agreeing to disagreeing with people. That's a great idea what you had before, what you said, and I like that. Hopefully, you're not going to talk about me when I get off the phone.
We talk about whatever
really
we got to talk
that
about. Go ahead. What's your and I appreciate that. So, but what's your thoughts of the day?
Well, listen, Bob brought up some really good ideas about. This is an unprecedented time that we're in. I really think that some good things are going to come out of this. If you look back in history when they had that plague in Europe, like he was talking about. A large portion of the population died, and the wages of everybody went up. I don't know exactly what it's going to be, in our society today, but hopefully, some good things are going to come out of it. We're going to know what pandemics are like. We're going to be ready for the next one, and just some other. I think a lot of good things may come out of it.
Well,
what do you think?
I think it's important to remain optimistic, but it's hard to imagine that a system that is geared so much towards the 1% making money that even this, that's being factored into how you respond to a pandemic. So I don't know. I wish I could be as optimistic as you are that we're going to learn from the mistakes from this thing because. It's not like there hasn't been situations before. I mean, you don't have to go all the way back to 1918 in the flu that got labeled the Spanish flu. I mean, you can look at how countries have dealt with other HIV, Ebola. I mean, there have been mistakes made, and then there were adjustments made to try to improve the situation. This has been, to me, the most catastrophic failure that I've ever seen as it relates to this. And it's been, obviously a lot of it rests with Trump, but I don't think, in all the praise that Governor Cuomo is getting, I think he reacted too slowly as well. I think there should have been an immediate effort, especially to protect the most vulnerable, the elderly and anybody with pre-existing conditions. I think there was such a failure to be ready for this in terms of things like basic materials like PPE and these kind of things that it's almost unforgivable the level of incompetence that has been displayed across the board. So I think there will be some changes, but like you said, the system that exists in the United States if making N95 masks is not profitable, then IBM, or whoever, 3M is not going to make them, because their shareholders are going to demand they make the profitable stuff, not the, if it makes more sense to buy it elsewhere, then you buy it, and then you become vulnerable to the, Chinese producers or producers wherever else. I think the system is still really, really flawed, and I don't see the pandemic fixing it. So I hope some positive things come out of this thing. I'd love to see wages increase. I don't know why there'd be any belief that would happen, simply because of a pandemic. But I appreciate the sentiment. All right.
Okay.
Go ahead. You're still there.
No, I think I don't think Trump is going to be reelected. I think that's one good thing that's going to come out of this.
Well, yeah.
By the way,
on that note, I will say I think COVID-19 may defeat Trump. Unfortunately, they didn't put up a very good candidate to defeat him without such a thing, and it creates this really kind of strange and almost morbid sense of that the Democrats gotta hope that Trump's mishandling, even though it costs lives, is recognized enough that he is not reelected. It's a strange dynamic when you think about what you have to factor in. I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden. I never was, and while he may defeat Trump, it will be because of Trump's failings, not because if Joe Biden was a good candidate, he wouldn't have had to run 4 times to become the president of the United States.
Yes, for sure. By the way, hello to Russell out there and all my other friends.
All right. Well, thanks for calling, Charlie. No problems with you today. All right, Reggie, go ahead and queue up our next caller. And
all right, they're ready.
All right. What's your name and where you're calling from? Turn your radio down, if you will.
Okay, now I have it off. This is Diane from the Bronx, and I'm happy to get into your show today.
Well, thanks for being a part of it.
And be part of it. Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to talk about the issue with, who's the ones? About, I think we focus too much attention on 45 and act as if he's solely responsible for all this. But there are a lot of people, that are making and have made, a lot of money in the market, and those are the people that, definitely want to make sure that the program continues. And as Naomi Klein has said, there are those who never let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
So, and in this epidemic that has come on, it's an opportunity, at least for all of us who are paying attention, to say, look and see the things that are going wrong, and we should definitely not be interested in going back. It should be, wait a minute, see the disparities that are going on, and and endeavor to. We need to focus on changing those things.
Yeah,
So,
I think it would be a terrible thing if we fell back into the comfort. Yeah, into the comfort that we thought we had. I think we need to make sure that we do some take up some positive changes going forward. And and again, I on your first comment, look, I don't blame Trump for the epidemic, but there's no denying that he has demonstrated just utter incompetence in the way that he's dealt with it. But I don't think he's alone. I think there's been a lot of people that, and we're seeing it now. All the efforts that people are conceding to a relatively few people who, for some reason, can't handle being at home with their families for 5 weeks without losing their mind. Look, I understand that life has changed over the last 5 weeks, 6 weeks, and I get that. But I'll tell you, we better have a better sense for what the real safety nets are. Because here's the thing, and I never even got into this with Bob Hennelly, but the economic ramifications of what has taken place isn't necessarily what we're feeling today. This isn't just about throwing a light switch back on and saying, okay, everything can return to the way it was. There's going to be some major consequences for the huge amount of debt that the United States had even pre-COVID-19, and certainly has taken even more debt on. And it's not just the United States. So there's all over the world, there has been an increase an uptick in the amount of social benefits that have gone to people who, and there's a piper that has to be paid for that. And so there's going to be some significant economic woes that are going to follow in the next year to come as a result of what's transpired here. And so I think there has to be a real sense for not just preparing for a second wave of COVID-19, but preparing for the impacts of of how this thing has been dealt with. All right, didn't know if we still had her on the line or not, but no, I do agree. We've got to.
Sorry, John.
No, that's fine.
She's still on the line.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I wanted to make one other point, and that was if we talk about these essential workers, okay, and we mean that word, look it up in the dictionary, then that would mean that these are the same people you cannot go back to saying, oh, we're going to give you, in some places, $7.25 when these people are putting their lives on the line. So the workers need to pay attention and say, well, wait a minute, if we're supposed to be these essential workers, well, how about giving us our due?
Well, I agree with that, and philosophically, that should be the way things go. But, unfortunately, when you look at the history of the United States, there was a clear delineation of who needed to do the work, to build up what has become of the United States. Slavery and in indentured servitude, those people were very much considered essential workers. They weren't valued. They weren't paid as if they were, somehow a priority in terms of worth. But they certainly, there was a period of time where when measuring the assets, the industrial assets of the United States in the 1860s, the number one investment in industrial assets for the United States was slavery. They were essential. They were essential to the
just FYI, John, we got 3 more calls after this.
Okay. All right. They were essential, all right, but unfortunately, they were never treated that way. And look, I hope and I wish today that people would put a higher value on those we are designating as essential workers, because I think there's a certain part of society that's saying they're essential because I need them to serve me. And and that's all those guys who went out and protested in those all those states that Trump tweeted about liberating. Those people wanted haircuts. Those people wanted their nails done. They wanted people to sit at a table and have somebody bring them food. They didn't want to. That's what they were. That's what they were protesting. They weren't protesting because of what they couldn't do. They were protesting on what they couldn't receive in terms of services. So I think it's important to remember that too. And I hope, and I'm hope like Charlie, and I hope like you that things improve when this is done. But the history of the United States doesn't bode well for the future. Let me tell you. All right, let me go to next caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, John, it's Jeff from Union County, New Jersey. How are you?
Hey, Jeff, it's good to hear from you. How you doing?
Oh, it's great to speak to you. I'm doing fine, thank God. Anyway, if you indulge me, I got a few quick points I'd like to make.
Go ahead.
Okay, speaking to earlier in the show with you and Mr. Hennelly were talking, there's an old saying. They say that which cannot be cured must be endured.
Sure.
Okay, so when you say how are we going to get through this, if you have no choice, you get through it the best way you can. That's what every day I get up and I'm thankful that I got up and I'm still able to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, the trouble, and look, and I agree with that, but the reality is not everybody's going to endure it. Some people are going to be casualties of this, and it's not just.
Absolutely.
The biggest casualty, the most disconcerting casualty is the human life. But there's also going to be, casualties, associated with companies that don't survive, and livings that have been ruined, families that have been destroyed, not just by death, but by everything else. So, but there's no humanity's going to survive this. In a bigger sense, Americans are going to survive. People are going to survive, but it doesn't mean that every person is going to. So I agree with you. I agree with you.
That's the terrible thing. You had Dr. Oz come out and say that, maybe it's a good idea for kids to go back to school maybe 2 to 3% mortality rate is an acceptable risk. I mean, this guy's a doctor.
Of something.
Doctor's credo is first do no harm.
Yeah. No, and
My
again,
God, I mean, well, of course, he's a Fox correspondent. What do you expect?
well, and this is the idea of what do you prioritize in a crisis? I mean, I know the first thing that happens after a hurricane is look, they tally up the dead, and then they say how much economic impact there has been. The first thing bean counters start doing is, well, how much is this going to cost? I mean, it's amazing that this is kind of where we're at in terms of how we prioritize or how we evaluate each other, how we evaluate life, how we evaluate crisis.
We had he's gone. We have the next caller up.
Okay, sorry. I know he had a couple of other. Maybe he'll call back. I know Jeff had some other things he wanted to bring up, but no, we'll see. We'll go on. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, John, it's Greg calling from New Jersey.
Hey, Greg, how
Thanks
you doing?
for having Bob Hennelly on. It's another day, and hopefully it'll get better. Just real quick, if I may, you're in upstate near Buffalo, right?
Yeah, I don't know what. I guess we're considered upstate, but no, yeah, I'm actually. The Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation is about 30 miles south of Buffalo, and a little farther. Well, you don't get much farther west, I guess, until you get down. But yeah, so we're out near Buffalo.
So you're in an area, basically, I worked there for a month back in a great place called Cheektowaga in 1982.
Yeah, I know Cheektowaga well.
I will never forget, and still when I see some friends and relatives up there, the abandoned steelworks south of Buffalo, where like 50,000 people used to work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the areas in Youngstown, Pittsburgh, Altoona, Akron. I mean, this all happened 30, 40, and 50 years ago, where the industrial base of the United States was shipped overseas, and the financiers did great. People in New York City don't seem to see that so much, if you will. Binghamton, I mean, places that General Electric abandoned, Syracuse. The folks where you live were forgotten or abandoned 30, 40 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the Midwest, throughout upstate New York. And something you mentioned a couple weeks ago that really hit me, places on reservations that don't have running water in the Southwest.
It's not just in the Southwest. There are plenty of places that not only either don't have running water or their water has such a high level of toxicity that they have boil water mandates or they can't use the water at all. And that's on both sides of the what I call the imaginary line, that U.S.-Canadian border. The water quality that exists on native territories is absolutely dreadful. And again, when you look at Navajo, where you have 30% of the population doesn't have running water, it makes it a little bit hard to follow the these basic simple hygiene recommendations about washing your hands for 20 minutes or 20 seconds. I'm sorry. It just makes it virtually impossible.
Well, before I get to my main point, I travel a lot in my work in the 80s and 90s. And I'm, the typical nerd from New Jersey. I have my travel atlas. Every week we go to a different city. And one thing that really struck me back then, and even in the late 90s, my last trip for work I did, every time you'd see an area where it was like military base or weapons testing grounds, as you would see, thousands, a couple hundred square miles of a testing ground, what would be always near those places? Indian reservation.
Well, and that's
unbelievable.
It's absolutely true. And in fact, the San Carlos Apache, some of their lands turned out to be dumping grounds for Agent Orange. And so when you look at where some of these firing ranges have been, you look at places indigenous territories like Puerto Rico or Hawaii, where much of their land has been taken up by the military. And this isn't just a benign presence. These military bases do not have to follow any of the EPA guidelines. I mean,
exactly.
the Air Force Base up in Watertown, for instance, I knew a guy who had to develop the system for monitoring the amount of toxicity in the ground because of dumping jet fuel, just dumping, load after load after load of jet fuel onto the ground, and so they literally try to percolate that water, or dump water into the ground to try to percolate and monitor the levels of contamination. And if that's happening in Watertown, you can imagine what's happening when you're farther out in more of a wilderness area, away from from population centers. Just the
How about Oklahoma or Nevada,
sure,
Idaho, Montana? Okay, that struck me, and that's going back 30 years. Every place we went. Yeah, there's this horrendous toxic situation, uranium mines, and what's adjacent to that? A native reservation, if you will. My main point today is, if you will, real quick, there's something out there, folks, if you're home, Google search repo, R-E-P-O, repo markets. It's the Federal Reserve basically putting money into the Wall Street criminals. Now, John, this is something I became aware of about a year ago. The financial system almost melted down in September. Literally. They put a couple $1 trillion into this recently over the last couple months. And as of March 20th, now the feds, they're trying to put money to help people unemployed, blah, 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 which is tremendous. They're doing 1/10 of what they should be doing. But, John, check this out. On March 20th, the Federal Reserve put at 1.5% loans to the Wall Street communities, the hedge fund criminals, the investment banks, $1 trillion, my friend. For several days in a row, they put $1 trillion into hedge funds, into investment banks to continue the insane stuff they've been doing for the last 20 years. So trillions of dollars for the criminals on Wall Street, and basically crumbs for us workers. It's insane.
Well, and that's the stuff that is kind of public knowledge. The other thing that I was informed about was the amount of toxic assets that the Fed has been taking off of some of these large financial institutions' balance sheets. So they've been taking toxic assets off of their balance sheets, and at some point, these are risky assets that they have that will never reach the valuation point to where the Fed is made whole. So, there's always this idea, yes, we bailed them out, but they paid us back. That doesn't always happen that way. And in the meantime, you're tying up huge amounts of the U.S. Treasury to keep the wealthy. And so, I agree with you 100%.
So the guys in Southampton have another yacht, but the people in the Southwest don't have running water, or near where I live, the poor folks who live near the Ford toxic waste dump are still sick.
Right. And and they get they make their deals, and they buy their way out of settlements, and they can use the power of the legal army that they can put together to avoid ever. And that's what happened with Ford in terms of the Ramapo. They never paid up. They made a settlement. And the Ramapo were forced to accept a settlement, knowing that if they didn't accept the settlement that was offered, they risked not receiving anything at all. So, look, Greg,
tomorrow's May Day.
Yeah, May Day. Greg, I thank you for joining the show and bringing some of the conversation to us. I appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead and we'll go to another caller, and then we'll bottom out
all right,
the hour after that. But yeah, another caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi, John. It's Donna from Langhorne.
Hey, Donna. It's good to hear from you. How you been?
Well, dealing with stuff with my mom, and it seems like the elderly and the sick are going to be some of the fallout of people dealing with the COVID pandemic, because it seems that a lot of these nursing homes, and my mom's in an assisted living, she's in a really, a high-rated place and, very expensive place. And they have reduced their number of workers, caregivers, because they want to reduce the footprint, people coming in and out that could bring the disease in. But in the meantime, their chronic illnesses are being neglected. Like my mom has heart failure, which is supposed to be monitored every day, weights and fluid restrictions, and it was neglected. And for 5 days, it wasn't monitored, and so we had an issue to deal with that. Then she ended up with looked like some stroke symptoms, so she did finally end up in the hospital. They wouldn't send her to the hospital for the congestive heart failure. They refused because they were afraid she would get COVID-19. But in the meantime, you're trying to protect her from COVID-19, and she may die from her chronic illnesses. And I'm just wondering, it would be nice to see a report on that. Like, what is, how many people are going to die from neglect of their chronic illnesses because we're trying to protect them from COVID?
Well, and that's what Bob Hennelly and I were talking a little bit about, because I think some people are dying from their own neglect because of their fear to go to the hospital. But, the thing with nursing homes and assisted care facilities, it's even worse than that, because, those facilities make a decent amount of money. I mean, even if they're not for profits, they charge a decent amount of money. So the idea of outsourcing medical treatment is something that they avoid as much as possible. And of course, so you get their inability to deal with COVID-19 has been one issue, but you're absolutely right. You still have people aren't in these nursing homes and these assisted care facilities because they're in the best of health. Oftentimes, many times people are in nursing homes because the families can't provide the medical care that they need, and so if that becomes sacrificed, this gets into again a lot of what Bob and I were talking about. You're ignoring the rest of the population who, even without COVID-19, are still trying to deal with underlying conditions. There are cancer operations that are not taking place because they're being put off. It's not just quality of life; it's life and death that many of these. There's a calculation being made on what can be done and what should be done, and I agree with you. There's got to be a lot of people who are not receiving the care that they should be receiving, and really there's no real reason why the standard care that they should have been receiving should be sacrificed. There's really no reason for it.
No, and I would love to see somebody do a report on that, because we've just been through a really rough time with trying to get cooperation from, it was independent living, now she's in assisted living. We've just had a really hard time getting cooperation with them. I mean, I had to go up to their gates. We're not allowed on campus. I had to go up to their guard gate and say, my mother is being neglected, and I'm calling the police, and I'm making a police report because you are refusing to give her treatment. And ambulance came. They didn't take her to the hospital because in her state of mind, she refused to go to the hospital. She has declined so much since this has happened. They're in solitary confinement in their, they have a little apartment. They're confined to their apartment. They have no outside, way of seeing anybody, and they don't get to see us. And
that's a big issue. I understand the idea of limiting visits and that kind of stuff. I get that, but they should do everything they can with technology, as it is. There's no reason that you shouldn't be able to have a significant amount of FaceTime with your loved ones, whether it's electronically or not. And look, you should be able to have the candid conversations that you need to have with your loved ones to make sure that they are receiving the care that they are entitled to. So I agree with you. And I don't know, maybe this is something that Bob picks up.
Right. And a lot of these old folks, they're not tech savvy. So, I mean, they're just, some of these people just know how to use their cell phone. So, we've been trying to teach Mom how to do a video call, but she doesn't always get it. And then because of her mind declining with, some of the other stuff going on. And I really think that these homes or whatever should be helping them. They should have somebody to set up a time for them, to help them, to keep them, because now they've got a bunch of people who've declined.
Sure.
And now how do you get them back to, some kind of normalcy? The other thing I wanted to discuss was about the, reopening these businesses. That I did see something, I believe it was this morning, that when these businesses reopen, because there is, gainful employment provided to these people that are on unemployment, they lose their unemployment. Even if they're scared to go back and they're afraid of getting sick, they lose their unemployment. They don't have a choice. They are forced to go back. So
yeah, it's an interesting decision process, because there isn't the calculus put into there whether somebody should go back to work based on possibly spreading the disease more. I mean, so yeah, for a while there they were saying if you could work or collect unemployment, we're advising you to stay home and collect unemployment. But there's going to come a point in time where they're going to say, look, we're not giving you those choices. You have to go back to work, or you're going to suffer, even though you could collect unemployment for a while longer. I mean, it's nice to say that they extended benefits, but if they only extended benefits for, technically for a period of time, and then turn around and say, all right, we're not going to reach the extent of those benefits. We're going to force you to go back to work now. No, I think it's very problematic. And let's face it, some businesses, some companies, some workplaces are more dangerous than others when it comes to social distancing and spread and that kind of stuff.
Right. And just one other thing, when with the stimulus checks, there are people who are on Social Security who are doing well on Social Security. There are some people that are just fine, and I don't understand why those people got a stimulus check, because they haven't lost anything. They didn't lose income. They didn't lose employment, but yet there are some people who needed that check who haven't gotten it, and that to me seems like we know people that are well off on their Social Security check.
No, some people are actually making more money because of this. Between unemployment and the extra unemployment and these stimulus checks. And you're right. There are some people. Look, there are some people who collect Social Security or SSI or whatever else who were able to work up to a certain level without sacrificing that Social Security. So I understand that those people lost some income, but you're right. There is a certain segment of those on Social Security benefits that, frankly, lost nothing and are just benefiting from $1,200. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Since you brought it up, and before I go to a break here, I will say that the $8 billion that was supposed to go to native territories out of the $2 trillion, that still has not made it to any native territories. And for all of the hype that gets associated both with native people being elected to Congress and commitments that, the lip service that were paid, when all's said and done, we're still seeing native territories that will probably never see any of this financial assistance. So I don't know. Don, I want to thank you for joining me. It's always great to hear from you, and I wish you and your mother the best. I saw your text. I saw your post about washing chickens. I never really considered that before, but I won't get into that now.
No, it's not a good topic.
Yeah, not a good topic. All right.
You stay safe.
You too. Nice to hear from you. All right, Reggie, we'll spin another Murray tune, and then we'll take it to the top of the hour from there. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk. We'll be back in a moment. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk. We're without Regan DeLoggins today, but we'll have her back next week, I hope. I do want to give out the studio line again. It's 212.
We have two callers.
All right, good deal. 212-209-2877. That's the number to call to be a part of the show. Look forward to the conversation. Look forward to your comments, whether it's a comment about something that Bob Hennelly and I spoke about, or whether it's something you're pulling from your own observation. We'd love to hear from you. And we'd love to have you on the show. So, all right, we'll go to the callers we've got. Caller, you're up next. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Yes, hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi, John. I enjoy your show. It looks like a great day out there. I'm Steve in New York City.
Hey, Steve. It's good. It's good to hear from you.
Now, I have a question that maybe only you can answer from your perspective as a Native American. Have there been any studies done on chemtrails over reservations? Now, the reason I ask is because this has been going on for several decades. It's not a conspiracy theory. You can look it up on Wikipedia. It's called Operation Indigo Sky Cover. There are high-altitude drones spraying these crisscross patterns that disperse even above the cloud cover that we have right now over New York City. You won't see it until there's a little bit of a clearing and you can see the blue sky, but you can also see the crisscross pattern. Now, from what I know from chemtrails, having worked in Utah during the 2002 Winter Olympics, leading up to that time, I worked for the Mormon Church, and we had no precipitation in the sky for about 2.5 the Olympics. It was going to be a dry Olympics with no snow. Suddenly, within 3 days, we had snow. The week before the Olympics, they did their trial runs on Snow Basin, et cetera. And the weatherman confessed. He said, I see no predecessor for this, folks. We don't know where this snow is coming from. It didn't show up on any map. And yet, above the sky, you could see crisscross patterns from Taylorsville up to Salt Lake City, out to Park City. And coincidentally, people got so sick during 2002, this is early 2002, the ticket holders, a lot of my Mormon friends too, they were thinking of canceling their appointment with the Olympics because they were getting very sick. Fever, sore throats. It didn't make them bedridden, but they didn't know what it was. And the difference in this controlled experiment was the chemtrails. I see chemtrails above us just about every other day. Sometimes they don't spray for 3 days. And the pattern that I see is that people get well, and then they get sick all over again. They don't get bedridden, but they do have a fever. The signature of chemtrails is fever. This is one of the variables that has to be figured into this whole equation. And I don't hear any discussion from science, definitely not from WNYC, on this subject.
Well, again, from a native perspective, we don't. We have all we can do to keep a pipeline from being jammed through our territories, let alone being able to control what anybody's doing, high above us. But no, there's been no science to back up any chemtrail exposure over native territories. I'm quite certain of that. And I know there's a lot of conversation about chemtrails versus contrails and all of that. And I don't know until somebody can really thoroughly make a determination on that. It's a lot of it ends up being very speculative, and so I don't have a whole lot of information on it. And when you live in an area like where we do, in just off of Lake Erie, we have our weather patterns are very dynamic. So I can't imagine anything like that ever happening, being utilized in a big way around our areas. So look, I don't have a whole lot to contribute to that. I appreciate the call and your concern and excuse me, and but again, until somebody can make a more thorough analysis on this, there's not a whole lot that I can contribute to it. But I appreciate the call and I appreciate your concern. All right, let me go to the next caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hi, it's Russell. I'm in Yonkers right now, John.
Hey, Russell, how you doing?
I'm okay. It was interesting to hear Comrade Charlie from the Golden Ghetto of Roslyn Heights agree with Hillary Clinton. A great crisis like this is a terrible thing to waste. But I got news for Charlie that the pandemics of the past are nothing like this. Two facts. In 1917, John, 30% of the worldwide deaths were in India, where Great Britain drained all the food for the troops to fight World War I. They were starving. And number two, the medical science of that time all agreed that aspirin, the new drug, was the best thing to treat this with. Now, nowadays we know 4 grams of aspirin, terrible. They were giving them 30 grams. And they were bleeding from their noses and their eyes, and this is what killed people, medicine. Now, I want to ask you a couple of things, John. Are you going along with Gates and Fauci with the telephone tracking and forced vaccinations, number one? And number two, I want you to consider what it's like to spend a week with a child molester who is usually in the family when you cavalierly said, hey, 5 weeks with the family member, no problem. And number three, one more question, the raw data. How many more deaths are going on now than there were in March of 2019? How many more deaths in March of 2020? You seem to have that. And I'll listen to your answer on the radio. Thanks, John.
All right. Well, look, I don't agree with forced anything. I mean, So as far as forced vaccinations, look, people want to throw all the flu numbers out there. Most people don't get the flu vaccine. If you want to get a flu vaccine, then get a flu vaccine. So the idea of trying to force a COVID-19 vaccine, for one thing, that is, we will know a lot more by the time they come up with a vaccine for that. We'll know a lot more on not only, hopefully we'll learn more about whatever reliability such a vaccine, if they ever come up with one. Keep in mind, there are diseases that took 10, 12, 15 years to develop vaccines for, especially virus, when it comes to viruses. So I'm not going to concern myself about the forced nature. I'm not, the nature of forcing vaccines, or the whole idea of putting RFID chips or any stuff. I don't subscribe to any of that stuff. I would not support any such thing. But I will tell you, I know that there people have done it with their dogs, and they've considered doing it with their children, so they could track them and that kind of stuff. I find all that stuff to be a little bit creepy myself. Let me see. I know there's a couple of other questions you asked. I'm trying to figure, not trying to get lost by them. But again, talking about the aspirin being the solution to the Spanish flu. Look, that's equally going to be the problem with this, as people try to promote certain cures like chloroquine, and finding out that people were dying of heart attacks with it. When you're so desperate, to be able to promote some good news, even this resmetiviir, or what I think it's something like resmetiviir or whatever it is. This new one. Look,
That's right.
The idea of shortening the term of the illness a couple of days, that's great, but that's not a game changer, and it's going to take a while before people can figure out whether any of these treatments are really not only viable, but what are the other problems that it causes. I mean, there's effects that these things have. There's adverse effects that these things have. So, look, it's hard for me to get too excited about anybody pitching a cure. Least of all coming from the moron in the White House, who thinks being out in the sun's going to fix it, or whatever he was suggesting with ingesting disinfectant. I mean, look, it is entirely possible you could make a bad situation worse by the way that you treat it. Now, as far as me being cavalier about people being in abusive homes, I wasn't being cavalier about people being in abusive homes. The people who were out protesting, in various states because of Trump's liberation, cry across Twitter, they weren't trying to liberate children from abusive families. The idea of even turning it that way, I'm more than a little offended that you would have interpreted I think that anybody who wants to compare being stuck at home with your family with being in a prisoner of war, I don't know what that says to people who had to suffer through those kinds of atrocities. I think when people try to analogize what they feel like they're going through, what most people are experiencing here is a far cry from what people in many parts of the world have to live on a daily basis. And look, and to suggest that I was somehow being cavalier about children being in abusive homes, I reject that completely. But all right, let's see. We'll go to another caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hey man, this is TK.
Hey TK, thanks for joining the show.
I'm in Rockland County.
All right, Rockland.
I'm a Bronx person.
Rockland's been hit pretty hard. What's going on there?
Oh my goodness. Well, you saw them on TV with their funeral.
Mm-hmm.
We have the chosen ones here, so they get to do whatever they want, whenever they want, and nobody can say anything.
Right.
So it's not good. I'm gonna leave it at that. It's not good.
Yeah.
The numbers, when I think about all the people complaining about, I want to go, you could come to work. Come right here to FedEx, where we lost 20 people to the COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Come to FedEx. Come to, go work for Bezos. The post office, I'm sure they could use some temps with all the people they've lost. I just don't. I try to see the other side. to not think that these people are Satan, are devils, are really evil people. But they make it so hard. Because you say to yourself, do you not see the people suffering? Do you not see the people dying? Do you want me to walk you into one of these trailers in the back of one of these hospitals so you can look at the bodies laying on top of each other?
Mass graves out in Hard Island. There you go.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and it's so disheartening.
And these people who went out and protest. That's one thing, like I said, when people say "let no good crisis go to waste," I mean these guys waving their, the AR-15s and their Trump banners to go out and protest their captivity. I mean it's pretty pathetic. And you're right. At some point you've got to ask the question: do these guys even believe what they're saying, or are they just being opportunistic? And I think it's the latter.
Well, then we've gotten to a place where the insanity is you're making so much money that maybe they have figured out another place to live other than this planet. Because once you destroy this planet, what's the point of having the money?
Well, but here's the reality. These guys are always the short-term opportunistic people. These are the guys who, will always gauge everything on what have you done for me lately. And so they live for the moment, and they are always got a short view. Native people, we have this concept that we call 7 generations, where we try to live a life that's going to have positive impacts on our future generations. The ones that are so far out, we'll never see them. But that doesn't fit within the American, psyche. And and I see that even as people talk about this election. I just mentioned this in a conversation on Facebook the other day. When people say, well, Biden's not a great choice, but you got to vote for him anyway because they take Trump out. And I'm saying, and for me, I'm saying, look, first off, I don't vote in American elections because I'm Native, and I don't think it's my government. It's not my place to inject myself. But regardless of that, if you only view things in 2 years or 4 years and you don't look at the long term, look, after 3.5 years of Trump, the best that the Democrats could put up was Joe Biden. If you took if there were a stronger stance, when I suggest people boycott the election, look, I know people think I'm crazy for suggesting such a thing. Whether Biden wins or Trump wins, I don't see a huge change. I think there's either way you end up with a incoherent, elitist white man in the White House. Ooh, what a surprise! So for me, if a significant percentage of the population did not participate, they would be sending a signal that there has to be change. Change isn't something that's going to happen at a voting booth, and it's not going to happen by prayer, and it's not going to happen by voting. That's two of the things that I always say. I think people have to have a longer view about taking the steps now that's going to affect a bigger change a little farther down the road than just the next election cycle. That's my view.
Do we have to suffer before everybody else wakes up? Because obviously the suffering has not reached the level that'll wake the people up.
No, and it hasn't, and then there's a way to scapegoat all that suffering. So if you can twist it around, I mean, let's face it, there's a whole lot of people who vote and stand up against their own self-interest, and part of it's ignorance and willful ignorance. But part of it, I always come back to this, and I know it frustrates some of the listeners, but there is a race component to this thing, and there's a racism dynamic that's always at play. And look, like I said, you look at those people who all protest; they were all white. And it wasn't just a demonstration of white privilege. It was the tolerance of white supremacy that allowed those things to continue. I guarantee if people of color showed up on the Capitol steps fully armed, you don't think that there would have been a massive response from police? I mean, so when you look at these things, you realize, yes, there is a racial component. There's a reason why people of color are dying at a higher rate, not only at the hands of police, but at the hands of COVID-19. And it isn't just because we have a predisposition, that makes us vulnerable to these things. It's because the power dynamic is such, and look, and that's the way the states run. I mean, that's the way the political system. I mean, you look at everything from the from the electoral college disbursement of delegates, the way that works out. that's a slave era function. That comes directly out of the slave era. You know, when you look at the fact that every state has 2 senators, regardless of how small the population is, that is a disproportionate level of power that is granted to states that have a much higher white population than the diverse populations of the of states with bigger populations. So yeah, there's some issues that lie here, and you're right. I mean, there's a certain amount of suffering that happens, but here's the thing: revolution doesn't happen because of suffering. Revolution happens because people see that there's a better way, that there's a solution. It has to be hope. People are hopeful that they can affect change, because people will just tolerate. They'll just tolerate, misery.
Don't forget, 2 more callers.
All right, let me go.
Thank you for your.
Yeah, thank you, TK. We'll try to get these. Hey, Reggie, do we have a news break on this hour?
No. Let's just finish out the calls.
All right,
no news.
We got 2 more callers, so if you're not on the stack, then we probably won't get to you. But let's try to get these last 2 callers in. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yes, my name is Greg from New York, and I wanted to call to say, John, is a pleasure to meet you, and I just love your show. I love your show. I listen to Let's Talk Native. I also listen to the show on WBAI, and I must say, man, your political commentary is the best. Just keep up the good work. I also read a book once. I wanted to know your opinion on it. It's called "A Sorrow in Our Heart: The Life of Tecumseh." I think it's a great book. You might some might think it's a little fiction mixed into it. I forget the name of the author, but it's a pleasure to talk to you, and I just keep up the work. You got to listen to me. I catch every show, all 3 of them every week.
Well, I appreciate that. For those who don't know, I do 2 shows that are even more native based. They're called Let's Talk Native. I do them back here from my studio here. I happen to be doing my New York show from my studio here in Seneca Territory, but I do a show on Tuesdays and Saturday nights from 10 to 11. They go out as a podcast, as does this show goes out as a podcast, and we put them up as YouTube videos as well. And that's what the caller's talking about. Look, I appreciate the sentiment, and look, I try to be not just offer a native perspective, but a perspective that is based on me trying to take in as much information as possible. I'm not familiar with the book on Tecumseh, but I am familiar with Tecumseh, and he had a lot of phenomenal speeches and testimonials that he's given and that have been given towards him. He's one of the guys that in our history that is considered one of the more renowned leaders, and so I'll look for that book in particular and try to get a sense for how much creative license was taken. But I know Tecumseh was one of the best. All right, we'll go caller. You're up next, and you're up last. So thank you for joining Let's Talk. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, Peter, from One Race, calling from Tampa.
Hey, Peter, good to hear from you.
Okay, here's what's happening. This is just in time. But to focus, can we detour to the celestial? Because next Thursday at 6:45 in the morning, there's going to be a full moon, and it is the flower moon. Now, everyone knows about the harvest moon from that song, but what I just learned this week is that the Algonquins labeled all the full moons had different names. There's the wolf moon for January, the spring moon, or the pink moon. They were named after flowers. The harvest moon comes before the hunter moon, comes before the beaver moon. And I thought, what a beautiful thing. They were connecting the earthly with the celestial. They were in touch with the rhythms of the world, connecting our experience down here with the celestial. It was just, like a lot of people don't know that there are all these full moons were labeled by the Algonquins.
Well, and the same went for the Haudenosaunee. We use the moons, obviously, to track the yearly cycle. There's 13 full moons, throughout the year. It's not exactly, but it's pretty close to 13 full moons per year, and we labeled those moons also associated with the time of year. So it might have been, some of the plants, whether it's certain flowers or some of the things that we did during that cycle of the moon. We also, we utilize the moon, for for marking when we do certain ceremonies or festivals or other activities, planting when we did certain things with different foods and that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's no, I mean it isn't even as cosmic or celestial as some would make it out to be, as just it's very matter of fact. I mean, the moon comes out and it presents itself in its full face. We called the moon our grandmother. We gave that kind of relationship to it because we revered the fact that it was one of those changing lights in the nighttime sky. And we
start wrapping it up.
We put it to use. So, but Peter, I appreciate the call. I appreciate hearing from you, and it's always good to get somebody participating from long distance like Tampa. So I appreciate it. Hey, look, I don't know what the schedule is next week. I look forward to being back next week if we are on the schedule, and I know that Regan has a special guest lined up, so we'll get to it when we can. In the meantime, I do implore that you go to the pledge line, go to 516-620-3602, make a donation in the name of this show, make a donation to WBAI, and we'll be back as soon as we can. We'll be back one way or the other next week, but look for our podcast, look for our YouTube videos, look for Let's Talk, and look for Let's Talk Native, and we'll catch you next time. This is John Kane. Yahweh.